My wife, the CEO, threw me out after believing her daughter's lies. 2 weeks later, she asked if I'd reflected instead. I handed her divorce papers. Her daughter lost it. My name's Logan Pierce, and if you'd asked me 3 years ago where I'd be today, I would have painted you a picture so perfect it could have hung in the Louvre right next to the Mona Lisa, except with better lighting and a more expensive frame. I had everything a guy in his mid-30s could want. Or at least that's what I kept telling myself every morning while I knotted my tie and pretended not to notice the growing sense of dread pooling in my stomach like bad coffee. My wife, Victoria Langford, wasn't just successful. She was the kind of successful that made other successful people feel like they were playing in the minor leagues while she pitched in the World Series. CEO of Langford Holdings, a corporate consulting firm that basically printed money faster than the Federal Reserve, Victoria had this presence about her that could make a boardroom full of alpha males suddenly remember they had urgent emails to check. She'd walk into a meeting wearing a power suit that probably cost more than my first car, and grown men would literally apologize for breathing too loudly in her vicinity. I'm talking about the kind of woman who could negotiate a multi-million-dollar merger before her morning latte cooled down, then spend her lunch break critiquing my choice of tie, like she was Anna Wintour and I was some fashion-challenged intern who'd stumbled into Vogue headquarters wearing Crocs. We had everything that screamed, "We made it," in that obnoxious, Instagram-worthy way that makes your high school friends simultaneously jealous and suspicious. The penthouse apartment in the downtown skyrise with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city like we were gods surveying our kingdom, marble countertops that were probably mined by artisanal Italian craftsmen who sang opera while they worked, and a kitchen with appliances so advanced I'm pretty sure they were judging my cooking skills. We had the Range Rover that cost more than most people's college education, the one with heated seats that Victoria insisted were necessary for her back, even though we lived in a climate where it hit freezing maybe 2 weeks out of the year. We had the vacation photos in Santorini, the charity galas where we smiled for cameras while pretending we knew anything about the cause we were supposedly supporting, and the couple's gym membership we used exactly 3 times before it became just another monthly charge we were too busy to cancel. And then there was Tessa. Oh, Tessa. Victoria's 24-year-old daughter from her first marriage, a union she referred to as her starter marriage, with the same tone most people use when discussing a bad haircut they got in high school. Tessa had this way about her that made you simultaneously want to protect her and check your wallet to make sure it was still there. She was beautiful in that calculated, Instagram filter kind of way, with perfectly contoured cheekbones and hair that always looked like she'd just stepped out of a salon commercial, even though I'm 90% sure she'd just rolled out of bed at 2 in the afternoon. The girl had a biology degree from a state school that Victoria's money had definitely helped facilitate, but she wielded her minimal credentials like they were a PhD from Harvard, constantly dropping phrases like, "well, scientifically speaking," before saying something that would make actual scientists weep into their peer-reviewed journals. I swear to God, Tessa was hatched in some kind of sarcasm incubator, like there was a secret facility somewhere that specialized in creating people whose default setting was condescending with a side of eye roll. Every conversation with her felt like I was taking an exam I hadn't studied for, where the questions kept changing and the grading criteria seemed to be, how uncomfortable can we make Logan feel before breakfast? She had this talent for making even the most innocuous statement sound like a personal attack, like if I said, "nice weather we're having," she'd somehow twist it into an indictment of my character and possibly my entire generation's contribution to climate change. To the outside world, we looked like we'd been photoshopped straight out of a luxury lifestyle magazine, the kind with ads for watches that cost more than a car and vacation destinations that required you to know someone who knew someone just to get a reservation. We were the family that other families looked at during holiday parties and whispered about, with that perfect mixture of admiration and barely concealed envy. Victoria would introduce me as her husband with this proprietary pride, like I was another one of her successful acquisitions, right up there with her company's merger with that tech startup in Silicon Valley. We'd pose for pictures at corporate events, my arm around her waist, her smile absolutely radiant, Tessa standing slightly off to the side with an expression that managed to convey both disinterest and superiority simultaneously, which is honestly an impressive feat if you think about it. But behind the closed doors of our picture-perfect penthouse, away from the cameras and the carefully curated social media posts, and the colleagues who thought we had it all figured out, life was less elegant soiree and more three-ring circus run by someone who'd failed the ringmaster certification exam multiple times. It was a daily performance that would have made Broadway producers weep with envy at the sheer dramatic commitment involved. Tessa was the manipulative ringleader, conducting her orchestra of chaos with the precision of a maestro who'd sold their soul for the ability to create maximum discord. Victoria played the role of the blindfolded audience member, somehow completely oblivious to the fact that the show she was watching was nothing like the show that was actually happening, choosing to believe her daughter's narration over the reality unfolding right in front of her. And me? I was the confused clown, stumbling around in oversized shoes I never asked for, wondering at what point during this whole performance I'd agreed to participate in this particular act, and more importantly, how the hell I was supposed to exit stage left without the whole tent collapsing. Every morning started the same way. Victoria would be up at 5:30, already dressed and reviewing reports on her tablet before most people had hit snooze for the first time, while I'd shuffle into the kitchen trying to remember if coffee was supposed to taste this bitter or if that was just my life now. Tessa would emerge around noon, moving through the apartment like a ghost who was extremely disappointed in the haunting accommodations, trailing complaints about everything from the temperature of the air conditioning to the fact that we'd bought the wrong brand of organic oat milk, which apparently was a crime against humanity, and her very specific dietary requirements that changed every other week. Tessa Langford could turn a glass of water into a 5-act Shakespearean tragedy, complete with dramatic monologues, betrayal subplots, and at least 3 unnecessary costume changes. I'm talking about a level of drama that would make reality TV producers stand up and applaud while frantically taking notes for their next season. This girl didn't just live her life, she performed it, and somehow I'd been cast as the antagonist in her one-woman show without ever receiving a script or even a courtesy email about auditions. If I walked into the kitchen and said something as innocuous as, "Good morning," she'd somehow translate that into "Logan is attempting to assert dominance over my daily routine and control my circadian rhythms," then march straight to Victoria's home office to report that I was being oppressive and creating a hostile environment. I wish I was exaggerating, but I once got a 30-minute lecture from Victoria about respecting Tessa's boundaries because I'd had the audacity to say "bless you" after the girl sneezed. Apparently, that was me imposing my beliefs on her bodily functions, or some equally insane interpretation that Tessa had conjured up between her morning smoothie and her afternoon nap. The grocery shopping incident should have been my first real clue that I was dealing with someone who'd weaponized victimhood into an art form worthy of a museum exhibition. I'd stopped at Whole Foods on my way home from work, picked up the essentials, organic this, free-range that, whatever fancy labels made Victoria happy, and grabbed a few items I knew Tessa liked because, like an idiot, I was still trying to play the role of the good stepfather who gave a damn. I bought her favorite overpriced kombucha that tasted like carbonated gym socks, those weird kale chips that cost $8 a bag and probably had the nutritional value of cardboard, and some vegan cheese that I'm pretty sure was just sadness molded into a block. I came home, unpacked everything, organized it all in the fridge because God forbid anything was out of place in Victoria's meticulously maintained kitchen, and thought absolutely nothing of it. Just another Tuesday evening in the Pierce Langford household, right? Wrong. So incredibly wrong that if wrong was an Olympic sport, I would have just qualified for the national team. By the time Victoria got home that night, Tessa had already spun an entire conspiracy theory about how I was tracking the family finances like some kind of evil accountant plotting to embezzle funds through strategic grocery purchases. According to Tessa's revised version of reality, which she delivered with the confidence of a prosecutor presenting evidence to a grand jury, I was keeping detailed records of every penny spent in order to build a case against them. A case for what, exactly? She never quite clarified that part, but apparently buying groceries was step 1 in my master plan for financial domination. Victoria actually sat me down that night, in the living room with the uncomfortable designer furniture that looked amazing but felt like sitting on concrete wrapped in expensive fabric, and asked me, with complete seriousness, if I was monitoring their spending habits. I just stared at her, holding the receipt that literally itemized organic blueberries and almond milk, wondering if I'd accidentally slipped into an alternate dimension where basic household responsibilities were considered acts of aggression. But Tessa's real genius, the thing that honestly made me wonder if she'd minored in psychological warfare at that state school her mother's money had bought her way into, was her perfection of emotional theater. This girl could cry on command with the precision of a method actor who'd studied under Stanislavski himself. She had the whole repertoire down, the trembling lower lip that started slowly, building anticipation like the opening notes of a horror movie soundtrack, the eyes that would well up with tears at exactly the right moment for maximum impact, the slight quiver in her voice that made her sound like a wounded animal in a Sarah McLachlan commercial. She'd perfected the art of the crocodile tear, those fake drops of sadness that she could produce faster than a Hollywood special effects team, and she deployed them with the strategic timing of a military operation. The Oscar-worthy gasps were my personal favorite, these sharp intakes of breath that suggested she'd just witnessed something so traumatic that her entire worldview had been shattered, when in reality, I'd probably just asked her to maybe consider getting a job or contributing literally anything to the household besides negative energy and passive-aggressive post-it notes. Her signature move, the one she pulled out whenever she really wanted to seal the deal and ensure I looked like the villain in whatever story she was selling, was, "Mom, I just don't feel safe when he's around." She'd deliver this line with such conviction, such trembling vulnerability, that you'd think I was some kind of monster lurking in the shadows rather than a guy who worked in corporate consulting and whose idea of rebellion was buying name-brand cereal instead of the store brand. The truly magnificent part, the detail that elevated this from simple manipulation to absolute artistry, was that she'd usually deliver this performance right after asking me for a favor. I'm talking within minutes, sometimes seconds. She'd knock on my home office door, poke her head in with this sweet smile that should have come with a warning label, and ask if I could fix her laptop because her Wi-Fi wasn't working, or help her understand her car's maintenance light, or explain some basic adulting task that any 24-year-old should have figured out by now. I'd help her, because despite everything, some stupid part of me still thought maybe we could have a normal stepfather-stepdaughter relationship. And then before I could even close my laptop, she'd be in Victoria's office spinning tales about how uncomfortable I made her feel, how my presence in the apartment was oppressive, how she couldn't relax in her own home because of my threatening aura or whatever nonsense she'd invented that particular afternoon. The girl had the moral compass of a pirate, and not one of those romanticized, Johnny Depp-style pirates from the movies, but like an actual historical pirate, the kind who'd sell out their own crew for an extra share of the treasure and feel absolutely no remorse about it. She'd lie about things that were so easily verifiable that it actually insulted my intelligence that she thought anyone would believe her. She once told Victoria that I'd eaten her leftover Thai food from the fridge, and when I pointed out that I was literally allergic to peanuts and her pad Thai was drowning in peanut sauce, which she knew because we'd had that conversation at least 5 times, she just shrugged and said I must have forgotten about my allergy and my eagerness to steal her food. The fact that this explanation made 0 sense didn't matter. Victoria just sighed and told me to be more mindful of Tessa's belongings, like the real issue was my alleged food theft and not her daughter's compulsive lying. And her work ethic? Let me tell you about Tessa's work ethic, which could best be described as comparable to a decorative houseplant, but less useful because at least the plant produces oxygen. This was a girl who'd somehow managed to fail upward through life on her mother's money and her own ability to make excuses sound reasonable. She'd graduated college 2 years ago, barely, from what I'd pieced together from Victoria's carefully worded comments about alternative learning styles, and since then had cycled through exactly 0 jobs, 3 entrepreneurial ventures that never made it past the Instagram announcement phase, and about 7 different passion projects that mostly involved her buying expensive equipment and then abandoning it within a week. There was the photography phase, which resulted in Victoria buying her a camera that cost more than my monthly salary, followed by Tessa taking approximately 15 photos before deciding that the industry was too commercial for her artistic vision. Then came the fitness influencer era, complete with professional lighting setup and a ring light that now collected dust in the corner of her room, abandoned after she posted exactly 4 workout videos and got upset that she didn't immediately have 1 million followers. Most recently, She decided she was going to be a life coach, which was absolutely hilarious considering she couldn't coach herself out of bed before noon or into anything resembling a productive routine. But Victoria had already paid for some online certification course that Tessa never finished. But here's the thing that really got me. The detail that kept me up at night wondering what I'd done to deserve this particular circle of hell. Victoria believed every single word that came out of her daughter's mouth. Every single word. This woman, who could spot a bad investment from a mile away, who could read a contract and immediately identify every loophole and potential liability, who'd build an entire business empire on her ability to see through corporate BS and call people out on their nonsense, somehow had a complete blind spot when it came to her daughter. It was like Tessa had some kind of Jedi mind trick that only worked on her mother, or maybe Victoria was so desperate to believe that her daughter was the perfect angel she'd raised that she couldn't allow herself to see the reality of who Tessa actually was. Bless Victoria's iron-fisted, soft-headed heart. She could demolish a CEO in a board meeting with nothing but a raised eyebrow and a pointed question. But when it came to Tessa, she had all the critical thinking skills of a goldfish with short-term memory loss. I kept telling myself it was just a phase, some extended period of adjustment that would eventually pass once Tessa matured or moved out or got abducted by aliens who'd hopefully teach her some accountability. I figured that eventually, Victoria would see through the act, that the lies would become so obvious and so frequent that even her maternal blind spot couldn't protect Tessa from consequences anymore. I was patient, way more patient than I should have been, watching this whole circus unfold while biting my tongue so hard I'm surprised it didn't fall off. But then the lies started getting bigger, more elaborate, more dangerous. They evolved from petty complaints about me saying good morning to actual accusations that could damage my reputation, my career, my entire life. And suddenly, without ever auditioning for the role or even wanting a part in this twisted production, I became the villain in a movie I didn't even know was being filmed, complete with dramatic music and a plot that made absolutely no sense, but somehow everyone believed anyway. It started small, the way most disasters do, like a tiny crack in a dam that you don't notice until the whole thing collapses and you're drowning in water you didn't see coming. First, there was the missing money situation, which Victoria brought up one evening while we were supposedly having a relaxing dinner that felt about as relaxing as a root canal performed by a dentist with anger management issues. "Logan, did you take $500 from the household account?" she asked, not even looking up from her phone, where she was probably closing another $1 million deal while simultaneously destroying my peace of mind. I hadn't touched that account in weeks, maybe months, because honestly I'd learned early on that Victoria preferred to manage all the finances herself, treating our joint account like it was Fort Knox and I was a potential bank robber. Turns out, Tessa had withdrawn the cash for some emergency that she never quite explained, but somehow when Victoria's accounting-obsessed brain noticed the discrepancy, her daughter had already planted the seed that maybe, just maybe, I was being financially irresponsible. Then came the mysterious late-night calls, which apparently I was making to unknown numbers at 2 in the morning like some kind of secret agent conducting covert operations from our bedroom. Never mind that I was usually dead asleep by 11 because I actually had a job that required me to be functional during normal business hours, or that my phone records, which I offered to show Victoria multiple times, clearly proved I wasn't calling anyone except occasionally my mom and that one pizza place that stayed open late. But Tessa had heard me on the phone, whispering suspiciously, and isn't that interesting how I was being so secretive lately? The fact that what she'd probably heard was me sleep-talking, something I'd done since college and Victoria knew about, didn't seem to matter in this new reality where Tessa's imagination was being treated as documented evidence. But the real masterpiece, the lie that should have won Tessa some kind of award for creative fiction, was the classic, "I saw a Logan with a woman" routine that she rolled out like she was unveiling a sculpture at an art gallery. Picture this. I'm at the florist, the nice one downtown that Victoria liked because they imported roses from Ecuador or some other unnecessarily fancy place, and I'm picking out an anniversary bouquet because our 5-year anniversary was coming up and I was still naive enough to think romantic gestures mattered. I spent 20 minutes with the florist, a lovely 60-year-old woman named Margaret who showed me pictures of her grandkids while helping me choose between the premium and deluxe arrangements. and I walked out with a receipt that literally said, "Happy Anniversary, Love Logan," because I'd asked them to include a card with that exact message. Simple, straightforward, the kind of thing that normal people do in normal relationships. But in Tessa's retelling of this extremely boring errand, suddenly I was meeting with a younger woman at the flower shop, laughing intimately and exchanging meaningful glances like we were in some kind of romance novel. The story got back to Victoria through Tessa's carefully constructed narrative, probably delivered with those trademark crocodile tears and trembling lip combo. And by the time it reached my wife's ears, I wasn't buying anniversary flowers. I was apparently conducting an affair with someone young enough to make it scandalous. The fact that Margaret was literally old enough to be my mother and looked like everybody's grandmother didn't factor into Tessa's version of events, which she'd somehow witnessed despite the fact that she'd been at a yoga class across town, according to her own Instagram story from that morning. Victoria's entire tone changed overnight, like someone had flipped a switch and suddenly I was living with a different person. The woman who used to greet me after work with at least a smile, even if it was tired and distracted, now looked at me like I was a problem she needed to solve, a glitch in her otherwise perfect system. "You've been distant lately," she'd say while scrolling through her phone, reviewing whatever evidence Tessa had compiled like it was a holy manuscript handed down from on high. She'd squint at screenshots of text messages, my text messages, to my own friends and family, trying to find hidden meanings in conversations about fantasy football and whose turn it was to host Thanksgiving. "Who's Jessica?" she asked once, her voice sharp with suspicion. Jessica was my 50-year-old married coworker who I'd texted about a client meeting. But sure, let's make that into something sinister. The worst part was watching Victoria treat Tessa's fake evidence with more respect than she'd ever shown my actual explanations, diving into this manufactured mystery like she was Sherlock Holmes and I was Professor Moriarty. She had screenshots of my bank transfers, transactions I'd made weeks ago that Tessa had somehow obtained, probably by looking over Victoria's shoulder while she reviewed our accounts. Or maybe Victoria had just handed over access because God forbid she questioned her precious daughter's motives. And what were these suspicious transfers that apparently proved my infidelity and financial crimes? They were payments to a travel agency for a surprise anniversary trip to Italy, the romantic getaway I'd been planning for months, researching hotels in Tuscany and booking cooking classes in Florence because Victoria had mentioned once, 2 years ago, that she'd always wanted to go. Nothing says romance quite like your wife accusing you of money laundering over the vacation you booked to celebrate your marriage, right? By the time Victoria called a family meeting, which is corporate speak for your life is about to implode, I knew with absolute certainty that I was screwed. There's a particular tone that CEOs use when they're about to fire someone. This carefully controlled voice that's somehow both professional and devastatingly final. And Victoria had perfected it over years of crushing people's careers with the efficiency of a machine designed specifically for dream destruction. She sent me a calendar invite, an actual calendar invite, like I was some mid-level employee being called in for a performance review rather than her husband of 5 years. The meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m. on a Thursday, in our dining room, which we literally never used except for the occasional holiday dinner when Victoria wanted to impress her business associates with her ability to host like she'd stepped out of a Martha Stewart fever dream. I walked into that dining room knowing exactly what was coming but still hoping, like an idiot, that maybe Victoria would surprise me with a rare moment of rational thinking. Tessa was already sitting there, positioned at Victoria's right hand like some kind of evil advisor in a medieval court, sipping an oat milk latte that probably cost more than a reasonable person's lunch. She wasn't even trying to hide the smile playing at the corners of her mouth, that satisfied smirk of someone who'd just won a game that nobody else knew they were playing. She looked like she'd just hit the lottery, except instead of millions of dollars, her prize was my complete and total humiliation, which apparently was worth even more to her than cash. Victoria sat at the head of the table, because of course she did, in a power suit that screamed, "I'm about to ruin your day," and feel nothing about it. With her tablet in front of her displaying what I could only assume was Tessa's carefully curated collection of lies, half-truths, and completely fabricated evidence. She didn't even wait for me to sit down before launching into her prepared speech, which she'd probably rehearsed in the mirror like she was presenting to the board. "Logan, I can't trust you anymore, she said in that CEO tone, the one usually reserved for firing senior executives who'd embezzled money or violated company policy in some spectacular fashion. There was no warmth, no hesitation, no acknowledgement of the 5 years we'd spent together or the life we'd supposedly built. Just cold, clinical dismissal, like I was a failed business venture that needed to be liquidated immediately. Pack your things, she continued, and honestly, those 3 words hit harder than any divorce papers could have. Just like that. No questions, no benefit of the doubt, no consideration for the possibility that maybe, just maybe, her pathologically lying daughter wasn't the most reliable source of information about my character. There was no "let's talk about this," or "help me understand," or even "I'm struggling with this, but let's try to work it out." Just a direct order delivered with the kind of finality that made it clear this wasn't a discussion. It was a decree, and I was expected to comply like a good little employee being escorted out by security. I tried reasoning with her, which in retrospect was absolutely the wrong move, like trying to negotiate with a brick wall or convince a shark not to bite you because you seem like a nice person. Victoria, if you just look at the actual evidence instead of Tessa's version of events, I started, but I barely got 6 words out before Tessa leaned in dramatically, her hand flying to her chest like she was clutching pearls in a Victorian novel. "See, Mom," she whispered, except it was that stage whisper that's specifically designed to be heard by everyone in the room. "He's getting aggressive. This is exactly what I was talking about. I don't feel safe right now." Aggressive? I was holding a throw pillow from the couch, the decorative kind that serves no actual purpose except to make furniture look more expensive, standing a solid 8 feet away from both of them. Unless throw pillows had suddenly been reclassified as dangerous weapons by some federal agency I hadn't heard about, I was about as threatening as a golden retriever puppy. But facts didn't matter anymore in this twisted reality where Tessa's feelings carried more weight than objective truth. Victoria's expression hardened even more, which I didn't think was physically possible, and she pointed toward the bedroom like she was a judge banishing me from the kingdom. I packed one suitcase, just one, grabbing whatever clothes I could fit and my laptop because at least I still had my job, even if my marriage was circling the drain faster than water in a high-powered toilet. I left behind the Italian leather shoes Victoria had bought me for my birthday, the watch her company had given me as a gift when we got married, the framed photos of us from vacations that apparently meant nothing now. I walked through that penthouse one last time, past the marble countertops and the designer furniture and all the expensive bullshit that was supposed to represent our successful life together, feeling absolutely nothing except a weird sense of relief that I couldn't quite explain. Tessa watched me from the living room window as I loaded my suitcase into my car, standing there backlit like a villain in a thriller movie, and I swear to God I could see her smiling, actually smiling, like this was the best entertainment she'd had in months. I could practically hear her humming the Mission Impossible theme song as I drove away. I landed in a tiny downtown apartment that made shoebox apartments look spacious by comparison, the kind of place that real estate agents describe as cozy when they mean you'll bang your elbows on everything and probably develop claustrophobia. The pipes squeaked like they were auditioning for a horror movie every time anyone in the building used water, which was apparently constantly, because I swear those pipes never shut up. My upstairs neighbors treated karaoke like it was their spiritual calling, their divine purpose on this earth, belting out off-key renditions of Whitney Houston and Journey at volumes that suggested they thought they were performing at Madison Square Garden instead of a crappy apartment at 11 p.m. on a Wednesday. I'd gone from marble countertops that probably cost more than a car to laminate surfaces that were peeling at the corners, from a kitchen with appliances that could have been featured in a tech magazine to a microwave that sparked occasionally and a stove with only 3 working burners. My dinner routine transformed overnight from carefully plated meals that Victoria's personal chef would prepare. Yeah, we had a personal chef, because apparently cooking your own food was for people who didn't value their time, to microwave dinners that tasted like sadness wrapped in plastic. I became intimately familiar with every variety of frozen meal available at the grocery store down the street, rating them on a scale of barely edible to I've tasted worse but can't remember when. The Salisbury steak was a solid "this might be food," while the chicken Alfredo was more of a "I'm pretty sure this violates the Geneva Convention." I went from a wardrobe full of custom-tailored suits to wearing the same 3 outfits on rotation, because who was I trying to impress in my apartment that smelled faintly of the previous tenant's life choices and possibly a dead rodent somewhere in the walls? But here's the thing that nobody tells you about hitting rock bottom. Sometimes rock bottom is actually kind of liberating, like jumping out of a plane and realizing that falling isn't nearly as terrifying as you thought it would be. Something strange happened in that cramped apartment with its squeaky pipes and karaoke-obsessed neighbors and kitchen appliances that seemed held together by prayers and outdated safety standards. I felt free. Actually, genuinely free in a way I hadn't felt in years. Maybe ever since I'd married Victoria and entered her world of carefully curated perfection where everything had to look right and feel right and photograph well for social media. There were no more fake smiles required. No more pretending to care about which wine paired best with which cheese at dinner parties full of people who measured their self-worth in stock portfolios. No more lectures about brand image and how my choice of casual Friday attire might reflect poorly on Victoria's reputation, as if my decision to wear khakis instead of dress pants would somehow tank Langford Holdings' quarterly earnings. And God, no more Tessa. No more self-appointed life coach in designer pajamas that cost $300 pretending to be family while actively working to destroy my marriage from the inside out. No more walking on eggshells wondering if saying good morning would somehow be interpreted as a microaggression. No more having my every action scrutinized and translated into evidence of my apparent moral failings. The absence of her constant presence, her manufactured drama, her crocodile tears and Oscar-worthy performances felt like someone had removed a weight I'd been carrying so long I'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. I started noticing the silence in that tiny apartment, and it wasn't the uncomfortable silence that had filled the penthouse during those last few months, that heavy quiet that felt like pressure building before a storm. This was peaceful silence, the kind where you could actually hear yourself think without someone interrupting to critique your thoughts or question your motives. I spent my days working remotely from my makeshift home office, really just the kitchen table with my laptop and a lamp I'd bought from Target for $20. And my nights eating cereal straight from the box like an absolute rebel, standing in my kitchen at midnight in my boxers because I could, because there was nobody there to tell me it was inappropriate or violated some unspoken rule of civilized behavior. Sure, the fridge leaked, leaving a small puddle on the floor that I had to mop up every morning. And yes, the building's landlord seemed to operate on the principle that maintenance requests were more like suggestions he could ignore indefinitely. My couch, which came with the furnished apartment and had definitely seen better days, smelled suspiciously like regret mixed with the lingering scent of whoever had lived here before me. I'm guessing a chain smoker with a fondness for cheap cologne. But here's the thing, it was my regret. My cheap couch, my leaky fridge, my terrible microwave dinners. Nobody was judging my choices or documenting my failures or building a case against my character based on what I ate for breakfast. And somewhere between the instant noodles that I'd learned to doctor up with actual vegetables to make them almost nutritious and the Netflix reruns that became my evening entertainment, I started plotting my comeback. 2 weeks into my new life as a bachelor living in an apartment that could charitably be described as rustic and more accurately described as probably violating several housing codes, I was settling into a routine that involved way too much ramen and not enough sunlight. I'd wake up, work from my kitchen table while video conferencing with clients who had no idea I was calling in from what was essentially a glorified closet, and spend my evenings scrolling through my phone like every other lonely person in America, trying to avoid confronting their feelings. It was during one of these riveting evening scroll sessions, somewhere between watching cooking videos I'd never actually make and reading articles about celebrity drama I didn't care about, that I noticed something odd about Victoria's social media presence, or more specifically, the complete and total absence of it. Victoria was the kind of person who treated LinkedIn like it was her personal stage for broadcasting corporate success. She posted constantly, company milestones, industry insights, humble brags disguised as motivational content about leadership and perseverance. Her feed was usually a carefully curated stream of professional accomplishments, photos from conferences where she'd been a keynote speaker, and those inspirational quote graphics that CEOs love to share to prove they're both successful and philosophical. But for the past week and a half, there'd been nothing. Radio silence. Her last post was from 3 weeks ago, some generic thing about quarterly growth that had generated the usual flood of comments from people kissing up to her in hopes of future business opportunities. At first, I figured she was just busy, maybe dealing with a major acquisition or putting out some corporate fire that required her full attention. But then I started noticing that Langford Holdings' official company page wasn't posting updates either. No press releases, no announcements about new clients or completed projects. None of the carefully crafted corporate communications that usually flowed from their marketing department like a well-oiled machine designed to make the company look innovative and trustworthy. For a business that prided itself on maintaining constant visibility in the consulting world, this silence was weird. Like, really weird. The kind of weird that makes you curious even when you're supposed to be moving on with your life and definitely not stalking your ex-wife's company on social media. Then I stumbled on a LinkedIn post from one of Victoria's senior executives, a guy named Marcus Chun who'd always been decent to me at company events, probably because he was one of the few people there who didn't treat spouses like decorative accessories. His post was short, just one line. Prayers up for our CEO during this challenging time. That was it. No elaboration, no details, just that ominous sentence that could mean anything from a health crisis to a business disaster to something personal that was affecting her professionally. The comments section was full of concerned colleagues offering support and asking what happened, but Marcus hadn't responded to any of them, which only made the whole thing more mysterious and, honestly, more intriguing than it had any right to be. Curiosity turned into research, which is a polite way of saying I went down an internet rabbit hole that would have impressed a private investigator. I started digging through business news sites, searching for any mention of Langford Holdings or Victoria specifically, looking for some explanation for this unusual silence from a woman who treated publicity like oxygen. And that's when I found it, buried in a small business journal article that most people probably skipped right over. A brief mention that Langford Holdings was undergoing an internal audit due to financial irregularities discovered in their accounts. Financial irregularities. That's corporate speak for someone's been doing something shady with the money, and we're trying to figure out what the hell happened before the feds get involved. My brain immediately went to the obvious conclusion, Tessa. It had to be Tessa. That girl had the financial responsibility of a drunk sailor on shore leave combined with the entitlement of someone who'd never heard the word no in any meaningful context. I started thinking about all the times I'd seen her casually drop hundreds of dollars on shopping sprees, posting Instagram stories from expensive restaurants and luxury spas, flying to Miami for the weekend or Los Angeles for a music festival like plane tickets were disposable items. I'd always assumed Victoria was funding her daughter's lifestyle, which seemed reasonable given that the woman had more money than God and a blind spot the size of Texas when it came to Tessa's behavior. But what if it wasn't just Victoria's personal money? What if Tessa had figured out how to access the company accounts? I spent the next 3 days doing research that would have made the FBI proud, pulling together pieces of information from social media, business records, and my own memories of conversations I'd overheard during those years living in the penthouse. I cross-referenced Tessa's Instagram posts with dates of company transactions that I could access through public filings, and patterns started emerging like constellations in a previously dark sky. That trip to Bora Bora she'd taken in March, right around the same time Langford Holdings had marked a $15,000 expense for a wellness conference in French Polynesia that I'm pretty sure never actually happened. Because I remember Victoria complaining that month about how none of her executives had requested wellness budget allocations. The designer handbag collection Tessa had been flaunting all summer? Those purchases lined up perfectly with corporate expenses labeled as client entertainment and relationship-building investments, which is a creative way to describe buying yourself Gucci. But the real smoking gun, the piece of evidence that made me actually laugh out loud in my crappy apartment at 2 a.m, was a series of payments to a consultant named DJTA. Yes, with a $sign instead of an S, because apparently Tessa thought she was living in a rap video from 2003. I did some digging. Okay, fine, I did a lot of digging, borderline obsessive amounts of digging, and discovered that DJT was Tessa's stage name for her brief attempt at becoming a DJ/music producer, a career phase that lasted approximately 6 weeks, and produced exactly 0 actual music. But during those 6 weeks, DJ Tidalare had invoiced Langford Holdings for consulting services totaling over $50,000. Consulting services. This girl who couldn't consult her way out of a paper bag, who'd once asked me if Wi-Fi had calories because she was worried about her digital detox diet, had somehow convinced someone, probably herself using her mother's access, to pay her tens of thousands of dollars for imaginary work. I kept digging, and the rabbit hole just got deeper and more ridiculous. Personal shopping sprees at Nordstrom coded as client entertainment in the company books, as if Tessa was entertaining clients by showing them how to max out a credit card in under an hour. First-class plane tickets to fashion weeks in New York and Paris labeled as industry research and trend analysis, which would have been almost believable if Langford Holdings had anything to do with fashion instead of corporate consulting. Spa retreats marked as executive wellness initiatives that only one executive, spoiler alert, it was Tessa, who wasn't actually an executive, ever attended. Hotel suites and five-star resorts categorized as remote work facilities, even though Tessa didn't work remotely or otherwise, unless you counted posting selfies as a full-time job, which apparently she did. The same kid who'd once asked me, with complete seriousness, if microwaves worked using the same technology as cell phone towers because she'd read something on a wellness blog about electromagnetic frequencies, was now running what was essentially a one-woman embezzlement operation. The girl who couldn't figure out how to file her own taxes or understand why her credit card had a payment due date was somehow sophisticated enough to funnel corporate money into her personal accounts through fake invoices and creative expense coding. It would have been impressive if it wasn't so completely illegal and morally bankrupt, like watching someone fail upward through sheer audacity and access to other people's money. I compiled everything into a folder on my laptop, screenshots, transaction records, matching Instagram posts with company expenses, the works. I even found the LLC registration for DJ Tidalare Entertainment Consulting, which listed Tessa as the sole owner and had been created approximately 3 days before the first invoice to Langford Holdings. The address on the registration? The penthouse. My old address. The same apartment I'd been kicked out of for supposedly being untrustworthy. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife and serve it at one of those fancy dinner parties Victoria used to host. In total, I estimated Tessa had siphoned somewhere around $480,000 from her mother's company over the past 18 months. Almost $500,000 gone, spent on absolutely nothing of value unless you counted Instagram clout and a closet full of designer clothes as valuable investments in one's future. I spent the next 4 days living like a man possessed, except instead of being possessed by demons, I was possessed by spreadsheets, bank records, and an overwhelming desire for justice that probably wasn't healthy, but felt absolutely necessary for my mental survival. My crappy little apartment transformed into something that looked like a detective's office in a crime thriller, except instead of a corkboard with red string connecting clues, I had my laptop, 3 notebooks full of dates and transactions, and approximately 47 browser tabs open simultaneously because I kept finding new threads to pull on this sweater of fraud that Tessa had knitted herself. I barely slept, running on coffee that tasted like burnt rubber and spite, which honestly is a surprisingly effective fuel combination when you're motivated by the prospect of watching your manipulative stepdaughter face actual consequences for once in her privileged life. The receipts I gathered were absolutely beautiful in their damning clarity. I had screenshots of Tessa's Instagram stories geotagged from a luxury resort in the Maldives, posted on the exact same dates that Langford Holdings had paid $15,000 to something called Pacific Consulting Group for a 3-day strategic planning retreat. Spoiler alert, Pacific Consulting Group didn't exist, or at least not in any legitimate business registry I could find, and the address listed on the invoice led to a UPS store in a strip mall. I had credit card statements, obtained through some creative searching of documents Victoria had once shared with me when we were doing our taxes together, back when she still trusted me with financial information, showing purchases at Chanel, Louis Vuitton, and Prada on the same days that the company recorded client appreciation gifts and relationship maintenance expenses. Unless Langford Holdings was suddenly in the business of gifting clients $1,000 handbags, which seemed like a really inefficient way to maintain professional relationships, Tessa was literally shopping on the company dime and not even trying to hide it. But my favorite piece of evidence, The crown jewel of this investigation that made me actually fist pump the air like I'd scored a touchdown was a series of Venmo transactions that Tessa had apparently forgotten were visible to friends on the app. You know how Venmo has that social feed feature that shows what your friends are paying each other for, usually with cute emoji-filled descriptions? Well, Tessa had been using Venmo to pay herself from various accounts, and because she was apparently both a criminal and an idiot, she'd left the transactions public with descriptions like reimbursement for business stuff, nail polish sparkles, and paying myself back for that meeting, money mouth face. One transaction, for $3,000, literally just said, "Because I'm worth it, gemstone," which was either a really bold statement of self-worth or the kind of evidence that prosecutors dream about finding. I screenshot every single one, carefully noting the dates and amounts, cross-referencing them with company records that showed matching consultant payments going out on the same days. Then I did something I probably should have done years ago. I revisited our prenuptial agreement, that thick stack of legal documents that Victoria's attorneys had drawn up before our wedding and that I'd signed without paying too much attention because I was in love and stupid and figured we'd be together forever, so what did it matter? Turns out, it mattered a lot, and in ways that were about to work spectacularly in my favor. I called up my old law school buddy, Riley Kane, who'd gone on to become a divorce attorney with a reputation for handling messy high-net-worth cases and a personal taste for what he called revenge litigation, which is exactly what it sounds like. Riley specialized in cases where one spouse had been wronged and wanted not just a divorce, but complete and total vindication, preferably with the other party crying in a courtroom while a judge explained exactly how badly they'd screwed up. We met at a coffee shop downtown, one of those hipster places where the baristas had doctoral degrees in coffee science, or whatever they called their training, and I brought my laptop with all the evidence I compiled plus a printed copy of the prenup that I'd highlighted and annotated like I was studying for the bar exam. Riley ordered some complicated espresso drink that required the barista to use approximately 7 different pieces of equipment, and I just got a black coffee because I was too wired on adrenaline to care about fancy beverages. When I opened my laptop and started showing him what I'd found, walking him through the timeline of Tessa's fraud and the corresponding deterioration of my marriage, Riley started laughing. Not a polite chuckle, but a full-on belly laugh that made other customers turn and stare, the kind of laugh that suggested he was witnessing something so absurd it transcended normal human experience. "Logan," he said, once he'd composed himself enough to speak without giggling, "this isn't a divorce case. This is a jackpot with legal paperwork." He pointed at a specific clause in the prenup, Section 7, Paragraph 3, Subsection B, because lawyers apparently believe that nothing is official unless it's buried under at least 3 layers of categorization. The clause stated, in that special language that attorneys use to make simple concepts sound complicated, that if the marriage ended due to demonstrable irrational behavior by either party, including but not limited to unfounded accusations, baseless termination of the marital relationship, or actions taken without reasonable investigation of facts, then the prenup's standard asset division would be modified in favor of the wrong party. Basically, if Victoria kicked me out based on lies without bothering to verify the truth, I was entitled to a significantly larger settlement than the standard 50-50 split. But it got better. There was another clause, one that Victoria's lawyers had probably included thinking it would protect her, that stated any fraud or financial misconduct by immediate family members that directly impacted the marriage could be grounds for additional damages if the affected spouse could prove they'd attempted to address the situation and were ignored. Riley looked at me with the expression of a kid on Christmas morning who'd just unwrapped the exact present he'd been hoping for. "Do you realize what this means? If you can prove that you tried to tell Victoria about Tessa's behavior and she dismissed you, and that Tessa's actions directly led to your marriage ending, you're not just getting a fair divorce settlement. You're potentially looking at compensatory damages for emotional distress and reputational harm." We spent the next 3 hours going through everything, organizing the evidence into a coherent narrative that even the most skeptical judge would have to acknowledge. Riley kept making notes, occasionally pausing to shake his head in amazement at the sheer audacity of Tessa's fraud or the depth of Victoria's willful blindness. "I've seen some messy divorces," he told me as we wrapped up, gathering the documents into a folder that was starting to look impressively official, But this is special. This is the kind of case that lawyers talk about at conferences. Your stepdaughter basically wrote your winning lottery ticket and didn't even realize it. That night, I went back to my apartment feeling something I hadn't felt in months. Actual, genuine hope mixed with the kind of anticipation you get right before something major is about to happen. My phone buzzed around 9 p.m., and I nearly dropped it when I saw Victoria's name on the screen. The text was short, just 4 words that somehow managed to be both condescending and pathetic. Have you reflected? Like I was a child who'd been sent to time out and was now expected to apologize for misbehaving. Like the past few weeks of exile were supposed to have broken me down into someone willing to come crawling back and beg for forgiveness for crimes I hadn't committed. I stared at that text for a solid 5 minutes, thinking about how I would have responded 3 weeks ago. Apologetic, explanatory, desperate to make her understand. But that version of Logan was gone, replaced by someone who'd done his homework and knew exactly what cards he was holding. I typed back a response that was probably the most satisfying 6 words I'd ever written. More than you know. Let's talk. Short, mysterious, giving away nothing while suggesting everything. Victoria responded within seconds, which told me she was more rattled than she wanted to admit. My office tomorrow. 2 p.m. I confirmed the meeting and then texted Riley, who responded with a simple thumbs-up emoji and game time. I spent the rest of the evening preparing, reviewing the documents one more time, rehearsing what I'd say and how I'd handle various responses. I pulled out my best suit from the closet, the charcoal gray one that Victoria had bought me for our wedding reception, the one that fit perfectly and made me look like I belonged in boardrooms and country clubs. The irony of wearing her gift to the meeting where I'd essentially destroy her world wasn't lost on me, and honestly, it felt appropriate. Poetic, even. The next morning, I woke up with the kind of nervous energy that makes you feel like you've consumed 17 espresso shots even though you haven't had any caffeine yet. That electric anticipation that comes from knowing you're about to detonate a bomb in the middle of someone's carefully constructed reality, and there's no going back once you light the fuse. I showered, shaved carefully like I was preparing for a job interview that would determine the rest of my life, and put on that charcoal gray suit that fit like it had been designed specifically for this moment of reckoning. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror, my crappy apartment bathroom mirror that had a crack in the corner and was surrounded by lighting that made everyone look slightly jaundiced, and barely recognized the guy staring back at me. He looked confident, determined, maybe even a little dangerous in that corporate attorney way where the real damage happens with paperwork instead of fists. Riley met me in the lobby of the Langford Holdings building at 1:45, giving us exactly 15 minutes before the scheduled meeting, which he said was the perfect amount of time to make an entrance without seeming too eager or too late. He was carrying a leather briefcase that probably cost more than my monthly rent, wearing a suit that screamed, "I'd bill $400 an hour, and I'm worth every penny," and had this smile on his face like a shark that had just spotted a wounded seal. "You ready for this?" he asked, and I nodded because speaking felt like it might break the spell of determination I'd wrapped around myself like armor. We took the elevator up to the executive floor, that fancy top level with the mahogany everything and the administrative assistants who looked like they'd been hired based on their ability to intimidate visitors with nothing but a perfectly raised eyebrow. Victoria's personal assistant, Diane, a woman in her 50s who'd always been professionally polite to me in that way that suggested she was trained to be courteous to everyone regardless of whether she actually liked them, looked genuinely surprised to see me walk in with an attorney. "Mr. Pierce," she said, her voice carefully neutral, "Mrs. Langford Pierce is expecting you in the main conference room." Not her office, I noticed, but the conference room. The big one with the massive table that could seat 20 people and the windows that overlooked the entire city like a throne room with a view. Victoria was making a statement with the location choice, establishing dominance through real estate, reminding me that this was her territory and I was just a visitor who should be grateful to be allowed back in the building at all. The conference room doors were already open when we arrived, and the scene inside was exactly what I'd expected. Victoria sitting at the head of the table in a navy power suit that probably cost enough to feed a small village for a month, her posture perfect, her expression set in that CEO mask of controlled neutrality. And there, sitting to her right like some kind of evil henchman in a movie where the villain doesn't realize they're the villain, was Tessa. She was wearing designer athleisure, because apparently this meeting wasn't important enough for her to dress like an adult. Sipping something green and allegedly healthy from a plastic cup with a metal straw, looking simultaneously bored and smug in that unique way she'd perfected over the years. When she saw me walk in with Riley, her expression flickered. Just for a second, just a tiny crack in her confidence. But she recovered quickly, arranging her face back into that practiced look of innocent concern that she wore like a Halloween mask. They expected me to grovel. That much was obvious from the way they were positioned, from Victoria's stern expression that suggested she was prepared to listen to my apology with the patient tolerance of a teacher dealing with a particularly slow student. They probably had a whole script planned out in their heads. I'd beg for forgiveness, promise to do better, maybe cry a little to show I was properly remorseful, and then Victoria would graciously allow me back into the fold with new rules and restrictions that would make me basically a prisoner in my own marriage. It would have been a beautiful plan if I'd been the same desperate guy who'd packed his suitcase 3 weeks ago and left with his tail between his legs. Instead, I smiled. A real smile, not the fake ones I'd been wearing for years, and walked confidently to the opposite end of the table, Riley flanking me like a well-dressed bodyguard. I opened my briefcase with the kind of deliberate slowness that movie villains use when they're revealing their master plan, pulled out the divorce papers that Riley had prepared, and slid them across that expensive conference table with enough force that they glided perfectly to stop right in front of Victoria. The sound of paper sliding on polished wood was the only noise in the room for about 3 seconds, which felt like 3 hours, and I savored every millisecond of the silence before speaking. "Here's what reflection looks like," I said, my voice steady and clear, channeling every corporate presentation I'd ever given, except this time I was actually invested in the outcome instead of just trying to make it through another client meeting. You could actually hear the air leave the room, like someone had opened an airlock and all the oxygen got sucked out into space. Victoria's hand froze halfway to the papers, her perfectly maintained composure cracking just slightly around the edges. Tessa's jaw literally dropped. I'm talking full cartoon character shock, mouth open wide enough that I could see her tongue piercing that Victoria probably didn't know about. Like gravity had suddenly increased, and her facial muscles couldn't handle the strain. Her green smoothie slipped from her hand and hit the table with a dull thud, the lid popping off and sending health-conscious liquid spreading across the surface like a metaphor for her life spinning out of control. But I wasn't done. Not even close. I pulled out the second folder, the thick one that Riley and I had organized the night before with dividers and highlighted sections and sticky notes marking the most damning pages, and dropped it next to the divorce papers with a satisfying thump that echoed in the silent room. "And this," I continued, opening the folder to reveal the first page of financial records, "is a detailed report linking Tessa to $480,000 in unauthorized spending from Langford Holdings corporate accounts over the past 18 months. Luxury handbags coded as client gifts, private jets labeled as business travel, spa retreats marked as executive wellness programs, and my personal favorite, payments to a fake consulting company called DJ Thalare Entertainment, which I'm sure you'll be shocked to learn is owned and operated by your daughter, registered to our former address, and has provided exactly 0 hours of actual consulting services." I paused for dramatic effect, channeling every courtroom drama I'd ever watched, every movie scene where the hero finally gets to confront the villain with undeniable evidence. "So tell me, Victoria, was this part of Langford Holdings' official corporate wellness program? Because if so, you might want to review your definition of wellness with the IRS and possibly the FBI, since I'm pretty sure fraud therapy isn't a recognized medical treatment." The sarcasm in my voice could have cut glass, could have etched patterns into the expensive windows, could have stripped paint off walls. Riley made a small coughing sound that I recognized as suppressed laughter, and I felt a surge of satisfaction that made all those nights in my crappy apartment eating ramen and compiling evidence absolutely worth it. Tessa exploded like a bottle of champagne that had been shaken too hard and finally lost its cork. She shot up from her chair so fast it rolled backward and hit the wall, her face turning red in splotchy patches that clashed terribly with her designer athleisure. "You can't do this," she screamed, her voice hitting notes that probably registered on seismographs in neighboring states. "This is insane. You're ruining our lives. You're making all of this up because you're bitter and pathetic and you can't handle that mom finally saw through your manipulation. The projection in that statement was so thick you could serve it as pudding at a dessert buffet. She was literally describing herself while pointing fingers at me, which would have been funny if it wasn't so perfectly on brand for her complete lack of self-awareness. "Oh no," I said, maintaining that calm tone that I knew would infuriate her even more, because nothing makes crazy people angrier than someone refusing to match their energy. "I'm not making anything up. Every transaction is documented. Every receipt is real. Every invoice is in your handwriting or sent from your email address. I'm not ruining your life, Tessa. I'm just highlighting your absolutely terrible budgeting skills and your apparent belief that corporate embezzlement is a viable career path. Though I have to say, DJT$, really? The dollar sign is a nice touch. Very 2003. Very, I learned about business from watching MTV Cribs." Victoria's hands trembled as she picked up the financial report, her perfectly manicured fingers, nails done in that expensive neutral shade that wealthy women favor because apparently bright colors are too pedestrian, leaving slight indentations on the pages as she gripped them harder than necessary. I watched her eyes scan the first page, then the second, moving faster as she flipped through the documentation that Riley and I had organized with the precision of prosecutors building a case for a grand jury. Her face, usually so controlled and composed that it could have been carved from marble by some Renaissance sculptor specializing in intimidating businesswomen, went through about 17 different shades of pale, starting at concerned and progressing rapidly through horrified and landing somewhere around, "I'm going to be sick on this expensive conference table." The realization was hitting her in real time, and watching it unfold was like watching a building collapse in slow motion. You could see each floor crumbling, each support beam failing, the whole structure coming down piece by piece until there was nothing left but rubble and regret. She looked at a page documenting a $20,000 payment to T$A Consulting for brand strategy services dated exactly 3 days after Tessa had posted Instagram stories from a beach in Turks and Caicos with captions like "Manifesting Abundance Sparkles Water Wave" and "Treating Myself because I Deserve It Nail Polish." Then Victoria flipped to another section showing credit card charges at Bergdorf Goodman, totaling $8,000 on the same day the company books showed an expense for client appreciation gifts, except there were no clients listed as recipients and the items purchased, according to the itemized receipt I'd managed to obtain through some creative research, were all in Tessa's size. "Tessa," Victoria finally said, her voice coming out strangled and thin, nothing like her usual commanding tone that could silence a room full of arguing executives. "Tell me this isn't true. Tell me right now that this is some kind of mistake, some accounting error, some misunderstanding that we can clear up." It wasn't really a question, though. It was a plea, a desperate last-ditch attempt to maintain the illusion she'd built around her daughter, the fantasy that Tessa was just a misunderstood young woman finding her way in the world rather than a spoiled criminal who'd been systematically stealing from her own mother's company while simultaneously destroying her mother's marriage for fun. Tessa started with denial, because of course she did, cycling through the classic stages of being caught like she was following a textbook on how to react when your crimes are exposed. "It's not my fault," she wailed, and I had to physically bite my tongue to keep from laughing at the absurdity of that defense. Not, "I didn't do it," or "this is wrong," or even, "I can explain." Just straight to, "not my fault." Like the money had somehow embezzled itself, and she was just an innocent bystander who happened to benefit from autonomous corporate theft. "He's framing me. He's been planning this for months, probably years. He married you just to get access to the company so he could set me up and make me look bad because he's always been jealous of our relationship." The mental gymnastics required to arrive at that conclusion deserved an Olympic gold medal. In Tessa's twisted version of reality, I had apparently played the long game, marrying Victoria and tolerating years of Tessa's abuse, all as part of some elaborate scheme to frame her for crimes she actually committed. It was like watching someone argue that the sky isn't blue while standing outside on a cloudless day. That level of disconnect from objective reality that makes you wonder if you're the crazy one for expecting logic to matter. "Really?" I said, unable to resist jumping in because the temptation to poke holes in her nonsense was too strong to ignore. I traveled back in time and forced you to create a fake LLC called DJ $2 Entertainment. I used my mind control powers to make you invoice your mother's company for consulting services you never provided. I somehow photoshopped your own Instagram posts showing you on luxury vacations that coincidentally match up with company expense reports down to the exact dates. I pulled out my phone because I'd come prepared with even more evidence than what was in the folders, and pulled up Tessa's Instagram account that she'd somehow forgotten to make private despite being in the middle of committing fraud. Here's you in Bora Bora, posted June 15th, with the caption "Corporate Retreat Vibes" and about 40 hashtags. And here's the company expense report showing a $15,000 payment for a strategic planning retreat in French Polynesia on June 14th. But sure, I totally fabricated all of this because I'm a criminal mastermind who spent 5 years of my life in an elaborate setup. Victoria was now reading the section about forged signatures, her face going from pale to slightly green. That particular shade that suggests someone's digestive system is rebelling against the information their brain is processing. Riley had included expert analysis from a handwriting specialist. Yeah, we'd gone that far, because when you're building a case, you build it right. Comparing Tessa's signature on personal documents with the signatures on several corporate loan applications that had been submitted in Victoria's name but were clearly written by someone else. Someone with Tessa's distinctive loopy handwriting and her habit of adding unnecessary flourishes to letters that didn't need them, like she thought she was signing the Declaration of Independence instead of committing felony fraud. "You forged my signature?" Victoria whispered, looking up from the documents to stare at her daughter with an expression that mixed betrayal, horror, and the dawning realization that everything she believed about her precious child was a lie. "You took out business loans in my name? Tessa, do you understand what this means? This isn't just stealing from the company. This is identity theft, fraud, forgery. These are federal crimes. This is prison, actual prison, not some slap on the wrist or community service." That's when Tessa really lost it, transitioning from denial to rage with the smooth grace of a drunk person falling downstairs. She grabbed her phone from the table and hurled it across the room with surprising force for someone who claimed to do yoga and practice mindfulness. The phone sailed through the air in a perfect arc, missed my head by about 2 feet, which honestly was disappointing because if she'd actually hit me, it would have been assault on top of everything else, and smashed into a decorative vase sitting on the credenza that probably cost more than my car. The vase exploded in a very satisfying shower of crystal shards, and the flowers it had contained, some pretentious arrangement of orchids and exotic greenery, scattered across the floor in a mess that the cleaning crew was definitely not paid enough to deal with. "You destroyed everything," Tessa screamed, her voice reaching frequencies that probably bothered dogs in a 3-block radius. Tears were streaming down her face now, real ones for once instead of her practiced crocodile tears, mascara running in dark streaks that made her look like a raccoon having an existential crisis. "We had a perfect family. We were happy. And you came in with your stupid face and your stupid normal person job, and you ruined it because you couldn't handle that mom loved me more than you. This is all your fault. Everything that's happening is because you couldn't just be grateful that she married someone like you." "Correction," I said, standing up and walking around the table slowly, deliberately, like a lawyer approaching a hostile witness on a courtroom drama. I stopped a safe distance away. Tessa had already demonstrated her willingness to throw objects, and I wasn't interested in testing whether she'd escalate to physical violence, and looked her directly in the eyes. "You destroyed everything. You bought everything, the handbags, the trips, the spa days, the fake business expenses, with your mom's credit card, and then you called it empowerment. You convinced yourself that you deserved all of it because you're special, because the rules that apply to normal people don't apply to you. And when I started asking questions or suggesting you might want to, I don't know, get a job or contribute something other than drama to the household, you decided to eliminate the problem by turning your mother against me. You didn't destroy just my marriage, Tessa. You destroyed your mother's company, her reputation, and probably her freedom, depending on how the SEC and the IRS decide to handle this situation." Victoria stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor with a sound like nails on a chalkboard, and for a second I thought she might actually faint because she swayed slightly before catching herself on the table. She looked at her daughter, really looked at her, maybe for the first time in years without the rose-colored glasses of maternal blindness, and I could see the exact moment when everything clicked into place. All the little inconsistencies she'd probably noticed and dismissed. All the times Tessa's stories hadn't quite added up, but Victoria had chosen to believe them anyway. All the red flags she'd ignored because acknowledging them would mean admitting that her daughter was not the person she'd thought she was. It all came crashing down at once, and the weight of that